Hello, thank you for tuning in to the Lessons of Vietnam show. Here we strive to tell the real stories of the Vietnam War and the men and women who served during the Vietnam War. We feel like it's important to dispel the myths, mistruths, and downright stories of the people who served in Vietnam as well as the war itself. I am Bill Dixon. I'm your host. I'm a Vietnam veteran of 1967 to 1968, Tet survivor. And as I said, your host for the show tonight. We broadcast from the Raleigh, North Carolina studios of Nissan Communications, and they give us the opportunity to tell the real story of the Vietnam War. You're welcome to, and encouraged, by the way, to participate with your host and or any guests we have. Tonight we don't have any guests. You're stuck with me. But if you have any comments or questions, just call the number that you see on the screen there or use Skype and make your comment, be part of the show. We love the participation. And if you see a part of the show that you want to make a comment on, whether it's good, bad, disagree, agree, add to, you're welcome to do it. Tonight's our show is a little bit unusual. We're going to be calling it Heroes and Zeros. We're going to be talking about some real heroes of the Vietnam War and the Vietnam era. And then we're going to talk about some real zeros of the Vietnam era and so forth. So let's get started on our first story here. Heroes and zeros. The word heroes kind of, to me, gets overused, but we're going to use it tonight for these people because I tell you, if you read their stories and didn't know they were true stories, you would swear that the author was a great fiction writer. It's the stories of these heroes that we're going to be talking about tonight, just unbelievable, the things they did and went through and so forth. So as we move on, we're going to tell the stories of and their achievements. And as far as I'm concerned, they're heroes. Everybody who went to Vietnam was not necessarily a hero. I do appreciate when people come up and say, I appreciate your service. And I tell them I appreciate their appreciation. But I was far from a hero. I did my job. I did it the best I could do, but don't make me no hero out of it. I was just there. I didn't want to go there, but nobody asked me. So there I was. And as we move on, I think we're starting with some hero. No, let's see. We're going to start with a zero, right? I'll start with my favorite zero. Jane Fonda. Jane Fonda is, as far as I'm concerned, a big hero. Now, I mean, zero. A lot of the information out there about what Jane did is, there's a whole lot of mistruths out there about her. It was bad enough as she was, but there's a lot of mistruths out there and so forth. But let's just talk about this article is written by this gentleman here, by Colby Itkowitz. He says, on a hot, sticky May afternoon in 1970, a crowd of several thousand students and protesters took over the University of Maryland Mall. Many were protesting the Vietnam War. A lot of protesting going on back then. But listen, if you're a single guy or girl, I can understand why you protest, because their mantra was make love, not war, and free drugs. I mean, who wouldn't want to go for that? But this was, everybody also wanted to get a glimpse of this big-time star and daughter of Henry Fonda, Henry Fonda was one of the most revered, respected actors of his time there and so forth. But let's talk a little bit more about Jane. And as you can see there, she cut her hair and kind of got rid of the blonde. She let it grow brown. And if you can see right over there on the left side of your screen, there's quite a bit of those out there still. The Hanoi Jane urinal targets. And you can kind of get an idea where they were, what they were for, and where they went and so forth. But as the war raged, the one-time bombshell, if you ever saw the movie Barbarella, she is a very attractive woman and had a great body. I guess I can say that without being too chauvinistic or whatever, but she was a good-looking woman in her time. She traded in her sex appeal, it says in the article, for her liberal activism, and she became a political crusader. She was looking for something to get behind. her life had kind of turned into a dump. So on campus, she was pushing her movement towards U.S. soldiers to becoming a pacifist. The Army builds a tolerance for violence, she shouted at the crowd. If you think about it, what exactly is an army for but violence? When armies are not going out there and peacekeepers and so forth or humanitarians, they're taught to, well, they're taught to kill people, and rather than to be killed themselves. So, but she found it intolerable that an army should be aggressive. I guess we're going to call it, just for the lack of things. This is her famous picture. For the next several years, Fonda would continue as one of the most prominent public faces in the anti-war movement. But it wasn't until she traveled to Hanoi in July of 1972 that she really enraged us Vietnam vets and critics. And one of the things that enraged us most was this picture. This is her picture sitting at an anti-aircraft gun in Hanoi, waiting for the blonde-haired, blue-eyed murderers. Basically, she was looking for the American soldiers who were flying the airplanes and bombing Hanoi and so forth to come in. And she has apologized for this picture, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. So now we're going to move on to the next one. Fonda's transformation from actress to activist began several years earlier, before she got in there, because she was trying to find as something to get behind. She was active in the Black Panthers. She marched for rights of American Indian soldiers and working mothers. Like I said, she was trying to find a cause, her cause. But she was advised by other activists to focus her political energies, decided to go all in as an impassionate voice for the anti-war movement. I mean, she fit right in on that one. She and actor Donald Sutherland, you remember him? He played the military quite a bit. He played one with Clint Eastwood that Donald Sutherland was a hippie, which he was in real life, so forth. But they started an anti-USO show to kind of offset Bob Hope's famous Christmas show. They call it the FTA. The FTA has, according to them, it meant free the army. But I can tell you, as a Vietnam veteran who used this phrase quite a bit in Vietnam, was the F the army, and it wasn't free. Okay. I won't go any farther than that. You can come up with your own explanation to that. But they were trying to offset all the good stuff that Bob Hope was doing. So they had their own show. All right. On July 1972, when Fonda accepted an invitation to visit North Vietnam, America had been at war overseas with itself for years. She went to tour the country's dike system. Hanoi is built below sea level, much like New Orleans. And all around the city of Hanoi are dikes to keep the water out. I know because I've been there and saw them. But she was upset because might be bombing the dikes. We're in a war, folks. The idea is to kill more of them than they kill of you and get the war over with. But she was mad because we might bomb the dikes and kill some people. What does she think bombs were doing? As you can see there, my host question, why we were at war? Why is it a problem with bombing the dikes? We could have saved a lot of lives, American and Vietnamese lives, had we been able to bomb the dikes. We bombed a lot of rice paddies and so forth just to keep from bombing where there were civilians. During her 2-week stay, Fonda concluded that Americans was unjustly bombing farmland and areas far-flung from military targets. She was complaining that we were bombing rice paddies rather than people, which I also found kind of strange. Fonda later confirmed that she made several radio announcements over the Voice of Vietnam radio to implore U.S. pilots to stop the bombings. Now let's think about it just a moment. Here's this woman who's the daughter of one of the prominent citizens and actors of our time, and you are a POW and you're eating rice with roach bugs in it and so forth to get a little meat and protein in there. And she's going on national news and television telling everybody about how terrible you are and how well you've been treated by the Vietnamese communists. If you were a prisoner of war, you would probably question her motives there. And as you can see there, this was a bumper sticker that was very prominent at the time. As you can see there, I'm not Fonda Hanoi Jane. I thought it was a great play on words there. I think I probably had one of those bumper stickers on my car at one time. Hanoi Fonda also met with 7 American POWs and later said they asked her to tell their friends and family to support presidential candidate George McGovern because they feared that they'd be freed, would never be freed during the Richard Nixon administration. So they were behind, according to Jane, and Jane wouldn't tell no lies that they were behind George McGovern. Okay. Rumors spread and still persist that she betrayed them by accepting secret notes and then turning them over to North Vietnamese. The POWs who were there have denied this ever occurred. Now, this is where the story comes about that has been proven to be myths out there. That was a strong story, and I believe my next slide will tell us a little bit about the story. I know it doesn't yet, but we will get there. As you can see, that's another picture sitting there in front of the anti-aircraft gun, and you can see she's kind of cutting up and having a good time, holding her ears so that she won't hear the noise and so forth that are coming in. And this is a lot of why she got the name Honora Jane. But this action here still enrages veterans. Most was that photograph of her with the North Vietnamese troops on an aircraft gun. This probably more than anything else gave her the Hanoi Jane and just ticked off a whole lot of people when this picture. Okay. After Fonda returned from her trip, the State Department spoke out against her. Didn't do anything, but they spoke out against her. It's always distressing to find American citizens who benefit from the protection and assistance of this government, lending their voice in any way to governments such as the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Distressing indeed, said State Department spokesman Charles W. Bray. Well, he spoke out about it, but unless you get hit in the head by a dictionary, words don't necessarily hurt you that much. Anyway, some lawmakers called her actions treason, but didn't do anything about it. Congress held hearings. I think things hadn't changed a whole lot. Congress is still really good about holding hearings and so forth. The Veterans of Foreign War, the VFW, passed a resolution calling for her to be prosecuted as a traitor. Everybody did all these things going, she's terrible and we don't like her, but she kept right on doing because nobody did anything about it. Next slide. In March 1973, the Maryland legislature held a hearing to have Jane Fonda and her films barred from Maryland. One legislator said, I wouldn't want to kill her, but I wouldn't mind if they cut her tongue off. Okay. Now, this was a report from Snopes. And Snopes has had its own problems recently. They have a problem with their own truth reports, but this is a report that they gave with the what we talked about with her with the American POWs. Jane Fonda betrayed American POWs. The long-standing claim that Jane Fonda turned smuggled messages from U.S. POWs over to their North Vietnamese captors is false. During a trip to North Vietnam, Jane Fonda turned smuggled messages from U.S. POWs over to the captors, and I'm going to go into how that worked about and so forth. So, in July 1972, during the waning days of U.S. military involvement in Vietnam, actress Jane Fonda incurred the animosity of untold thousands of Vietnam veterans as a result of this story. Fonda visited North Vietnamese villages, hospitals, schools, and factories and damaged in the war, weaving her comments about what she observed at those sites and denunciation of U.S. military policy and recording broadcasts as propaganda to U.S. In other words, she got on there and made a lot of propaganda statements to all over the country, all over the world. So other countries were looking at what she was saying, and here she was a big-time actress, and her father was a big-time guy, and she was making all these comments about the terrible things that we were doing in Vietnam to the Vietnamese people, and people were believing it. and she posed for those anti-aircraft guns. So there was a lot of animosity built up about her. And next slide, please. Although Fonda's action in visiting North Vietnam were sufficient to earn her the wrath of many Americans in the years since those events took place, they have been embellished to the point that one tale most commonly associated with her Vietnam trip is an incident that never took place. And this is an incident I've even talked about. A tale about U.S. POWs who furtively slipped message to Fonda while she was meeting with them, and who Fonda promptly traded by turning those messages over to the POWs' North Vietnamese captors, resulting in several of these prisoners being beaten, tortured, or killed. Okay. They would take the prisoners and clean them up and get them to have a bath, maybe even give them new clothes and so forth, just for when the dignitaries came. This is what the story is. The commandant of the United States Air Force Survival School, a colonel, was a former POW in the Holo prison, which we call the Hanoi Hilton. He was dragged from a stinking cesspool to a cell, clean, fed, and dressed in clean PJs, the black pajamas. They always got him cleaned up so they looked good on TV. And he was ordered to describe for a visiting American peace activist the lenient and humane treatment they would receive. He spat at Ms. Fonda and was clubbed and dragged away just because he spat at her because he didn't like what she'd been doing. During the subsequent beating, he fell forward upon the camp commandant's feet, accidentally pulling the man's shoes off, sending that officer berserk. In 78, the Air Force colonel still suffered from double vision, permanently grounding him from the Vietnamese officer's frenzied application of a wooden baton. Now, the story here was that, and I think we go into a little bit more on another slide, but they wanted to make sure that the people back home knew who they were because the North Vietnamese did not consider them as war prisoners of war. They were war crime people. And they didn't think they had to turn their names into people. So a lot of families back home did not know whether people were true POWs, dead, or just missing and so forth. Now, Larry Kerrigan spent 6 years at Hanoi Hilton, the first 3 of which he was listed as MIA. His wife lived on faith that he was still alive. His group, too, got the clean, fed, clothed routine in preparation for the peace delegation to visit. In other words, he got the good food, he got the cleaned up, and so forth, probably a shave, and they probably took his nice clean uniform away from him right after they left. They had time and devised a plan to get word to the world that they were still survived. Now, this is the way the story goes. Each man secreted a tiny piece of paper with his social security number on it in the palm of his hand. When he paraded before Miss Fonda and a cameraman, she walked the line, shaking each man's hand and asking little encouraging snippets like, "Aren't you sorry you bombed babies?" Great thing to ask POWs. "Are you grateful for the humane treatment from your benevolent captors?" And that made them feel good. Believing this had to be an act. I mean, after all, she's a superstar from America. They each palmed her their sliver of paper for her to bring. The idea was what she could bring it back home and people would know they're still alive. She took them all without missing a beat. At the end of the line, and once the camera stopped rolling to the shocked disbelief of the POWs, she turned to the officers in charge and handed them a little pile of notes. They were caught. 3 men died from the subsequent beatings. Colonel Kerrigan was almost number 4. This is the way the story was told. Okay? For years after their release, a group of determined former POWs, including Colonel Kerrigan, tried to bring Ms. Fonda and others up on charges of treason. Okay? That, I think, is true. I don't know don't know that they used it, but the charge of negligent homicide due to depraved indifference would also seem appropriate. Her obvious granting of aid and comfort to the enemy alone should have been sufficient of the treason count. However, to date, Jane Fonda has never been formally charged with anything and continues to enjoy the privileged life of the rich and famous. Good old Jane. The facts are that while in North Vietnam, Fonda met with only a single group of 7 U.S. POWs. All 7 of these POWs agreed to meet with her in advance. No POWs were tortured for declining to meet with her or for behaving inappropriately during the meeting. And no POWs secretly slipped Fonda a message which she turned over to the North Vietnamese. Now, according to Snopes, this is the true story. The person named in inflammatory claims about this alleged incident have repeatedly and categorically denied the events that supposedly they were part of. In other words, these 7 POWs have come back and said that the part about them beating up and her turning in the slips of paper, and they even having the slips of paper, for that matter, are not true. Despite the claims of hundreds of Vietnam veterans who maintained they were there and affirmed that accounts like the smuggled Social Security numbers betrayal are true because they supposedly witnessed them. Do you know how many people were at the Final Four when Michael Jordan scored all of his goals, who were there, who never were there? It's amazing how people get to embellish their stories. They can tell the story of something happened and, yeah, I was there. That makes it true. But the 7 Americans POWs while in North Vietnam were Edison Miller, Walter Wilbur, James Paget, David Wesley, Hosman, Kenneth James Fraser, William G. Burns, and Edward Elias. None of these men reported her sabotaging their attempts to slip information about themselves and anyone other than those 7 men whose assets he was there and witnessed such a scene is simply not telling the truth. Okay, there's a lot of people, and I heard the story over and over again, and I probably told that same story from time to time out there to people because I thought it was true too. But Colonel Larry Kerrigan, the U.S. serviceman whose name is used in the email reproduced at the head of this article, has affirmed that he neither claimed nor experienced any of the which has been attributed to him and has never even met Jane Fonda. This is the man who's supposed to have been knocked down, who got knocked down and knocked the guy's shoes off and so forth. So, according to Snopes, yeah. But it says in the article that he says it never happened. It's a figment of somebody's imagination, said retired Colonel Larry Kerrigan, one of the servicemen mentioned in the slips of paper incident. Kerrigan was shot down over North Vietnam in 1967 and did spend time in a POW camp. He has no idea why the story was attributed to him saying, I never met Jane Fonda. So there's still some question about all that went on there. But I tell you, even if you throw this story away as being true, she did enough stuff out there that it didn't make any difference. She was still a traitor. She was still committed treason. And as far as I'm concerned, she shouldn't even be allowed to be in this country again. But she apologized in 2005, kinda. See, she had a movie coming out, and the Vietnam vets were there to protesting the coming out of the movie and so forth. So she apologized. The release of the film being boycotted by Vietnam veterans, she apologized. But she came out here, as you can see, Fonda specifically apologized for the act of posing for photographs while seated at an inoperative North Vietnamese anti-aircraft gun, but not for her other activities in Vietnam. This is a quote from Honora Jane. I go to my grave regretting that the image of Jane Fonda Barbarella, Henry Fonda's daughter, just a woman sitting on any aircraft gun was a betrayal, said Fonda. Let's see. She's in a country that she shouldn't be because they're war with us. She's sitting in an anti-aircraft gun waiting for blonde-haired, blue-eyed murderers. And all she is ashamed of is that they took the picture. Or she got caught with the picture, I guess. She's not ashamed of being there. She's just ashamed that they took a picture and it got out. So it was like I was thumbing my nose at the military. Yeah, it was. And the country that gave me privilege. It was the largest lapse of judgment that I can ever even imagine. I don't thumb my nose at this country. I care deeply about the American soldier, which probably is why she led the anti-war movement along with Vietnam Veterans Against the War and John Kerry, who she financed that organization for a while. The actress and activist, however, defended her decision to go to Hanoi, and she had said she had no regrets about being photographed with American POWs there or making broadcasts on Radio Hanoi because she was trying to stop the war. You know, today there are people in jail and on death row who apologized for killing people. There are people in jail who apologize for being drunk drivers and killing people. But does that make them any less guilty of a crime? I don't think so. Okay. This is what Jane Fonda also had to say from another article. I try to put together truths and as much as I can. So I have to go in and do a lot of research and come up with different articles. If it's an article that says one way and another article says another way, I try to give that to you too. But this is an article by Ben Marquet. According to the Washington Times, Fonda was recently asked about that infamous trip to North Vietnam in '72. During an interview with Stephen Sacker of the BBC's Hard Talk program, and while she had no regrets about making that visit, she had second thoughts about the photo op that angered so many. I don't regret going to Vietnam, Fonda stated. The United States was bombing the dikes in North Vietnam, earthen dikes in the Red River Delta. If the dikes had given away, according to Henry Kissinger, somewhere around 2 million people could have died of famine and drowning. Okay. And we were bombing, and it wasn't being talked about. I don't know where she was, but it was being talked about everywhere I was and hearing about the bombing of North Vietnam. And I thought, here I am. I'm a celebrity. I'm a superstar. Maybe if I go and bring back evidence. And it did stop 2 months after I got back. So I'm proud that I went, and it changed my life all for the good. Pressed on the matter, though, and brought up the photo of Fonda on the anti-aircraft gun, which earned her the nickname Honora Jane. The thing I regret is that on my last day there, I made the mistake of going to a ceremony in an anti-aircraft gun. Fonda explained it wasn't being used at that time. Yeah. There was no airplanes or anything like that. It was a ceremony. It was just a harmless little ceremony. Nothing bad, you know. I was asked to sing, and people were laughing and so forth, and I was led, and I sat down, she continued. And then I got up, and as I was walked away, I realized, oh my gosh, I'm going to look like I'm against my own country's soldiers and siding with the enemy. Yeah. Which is the last thing in the world that was true. Okay. Well, I'll ask you what you think about that in just a minute. Fonda's actions indicate that she is indeed against her own country, siding with the enemy, whether they be of the foreign or domestic variety. Sakura asked pointedly, let me ask you a simple question. Are you proud of America today? To which Fonda immediately and emphatically replied, no. Okay. I get that. I think that last statement there kind of tells the whole story, doesn't it? It does for me. But I'm proud of the resistance, she quickly added. Honora Jane just stated that while in retrospect, she probably shouldn't have posed with enemy troops on an anti-aircraft gun. She still has no regrets about visiting with those enemy troops and, in essence, providing aid and comfort to those who wish to capture and kill Americans. In fact, even as Jane Fonda visited and was wined and dined by the North Vietnamese enemies of the United States, hundreds of American prisoners of war were suffering starvation and brutality in North Vietnamese prison camps. She brought no aid to them while she was laughing and singing with the enemy. And if you heard some of the previous shows where we've talked to some of the POWs and so forth, it was not exactly your normal Hilton. Here she is, some more pictures. Another Jane Fonda urinal sticker. And there she's there. But there she is speaking out at the anti-war rallies with John Kerry, who was one of the founders of the Vietnam Veterans Against America. He's one of the ones who went to North Vietnam himself while he was still actually in the service. He's the one that's called us all baby killers. That's why when we came home, we were all called baby killers because of the lies and mistruths that were spread about us by the anti-war people. But that's Jane's story. And next slide. Okay, now let's get off the Jane and let's talk about some heroes. The Vietnam Memorial Wall. If you've not been there, it's well worth the trip. You know, you see statues all the time, and that's what they are, statues. But when you go see this black wall set down into the earth, and you see the names of the men and women who died fighting for this country in Vietnam, it means so much more. Those are people. Those are people with families. You wonder what that would have come of those people. What good could they have done to the war, to this country? Could they have solved cancer problems? Could they have solved autism? We'll never know just what these men and women on the wall there. But along with those who are on the wall, we still have today men and women who went off the war and were subject to chemicals that were sprayed on them, which are killing them today in large groups, as well as their children and grandchildren. I saw a thing a couple of days ago that we're right at 3 million men and women who served in Vietnam. There's only 800,000 of them left today. They're dying fast because of the chemicals and so forth. But these are the men and women on the wall. There's 9 women on the wall. And to me, those are heroes. Those gave everything they had, and their families gave everything they had. So as far as I'm concerned, if you're going to look at hero, that's them. Now let's talk about another 0. Robert McNamara. Robert McNamara and Lyndon Baines Johnson came up with a problem one time. They needed more men. Now, where do you get these men? Now, when I went down to the induction center here in Raleigh, there were people there who obviously didn't want to go. We had a guy that had mascara and makeup on. He was wearing, let's see, I think they were blue panties with pink lace to get out of it. I heard of people who were taking drugs to raise their blood pressure and so forth because they didn't want to go. Well, McNamara and Johnson decided they were going to solve that problem. They needed more men. Now, they could go out there and do away with some of the college benefits. But see, if you went, I think the Vietnam War caused more people to get a college education than anything else in the history of this country. Because if you stayed in college and got decent grades, that you could stay in there and get a deferment. And a lot of the people who were going to college because their parents could afford it and so forth. And they didn't want to start drafting them because those people were good financial supporters to Johnson's reelection. So McNamara came up with the idea that people who were special needs, that if you make videotapes of things, you could train them to do things by videotapes, which later proved not true, plus the fact that he never made these videotapes. But he went out there and he lowered the standards, the IQ standards, with the idea of, I'm going to lower the IQ standards, but you're going to still have to keep up with the physical standards. So he was taking, basically, as we used to joke, if you could fog a mirror, you could get drafted. So a lot of these people who couldn't pass the test all of a sudden became drafted into the service, which created all kinds of problems for the people in the service as well as this men and women. Some people were drafted in who were low IQ, who could not pass the test and so forth, who did well under the structure of the military, but others didn't do so well. I suggest you get the book McNamara's Folly by Hamilton Gregg and read about it. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about it in just a second. Altogether, 354,000 of these men were taken in the armed forces. A large number of them were sent into combat. If you got a guy with low IQ, you can't make him a company clerk, or you can't teach him to type or whatever, but it's easy to teach a guy how to pull a trigger. So that's why a lot of them were sent into combat. The only problem was that you had these guys, if you're in combat, your life is really tied with the guy next to you. And if he can't figure out how to tie his shoes, you're not necessarily to be able to depend on him. So as a result of these men put into combat without training and who could not follow orders properly, they were, a great deal of them were either killed or ended up with bad conduct discharges because they couldn't follow orders. Now, these men and women served their time in country, but because of not being able to follow the strict regiment of the military and could follow the orders necessarily the way that somebody wanted them to, they got bad conduct discharges, which means they get no VA benefits. Now they're back and they're getting older, and Agent Orange or whatever is kicking in. They can't get benefits because they got bad conduct discharges. So they're paying the price twice. But you also had people who were, the judge gave them a choice. You either go into the service or go to jail. So you had a lot of misfits in there. You had a lot of criminals as well as the people. But to me, one of the worst things was that when you went from one unit to another, you took a file with you. It was called a 201 file. This 201 file was your whole story, but stamped on the outside of that 201 file in red stated that you were one of McNamara's special troops. So when you went someplace, the people there already knew who you were. And a lot of these people were called names and treated poorly in some of the bad units because they were these special trollers. They were called morons and imbeciles and idiots and everything else. You got to remember, this was a war zone. 19, 22-year-old guys. We were not always not always kind. Let's put it that way. Okay. Heroes. Tell you what, now these guys, you got to realize they're heroes. There's a lot of these guys, the medics and so forth, and docs got Medal of Honors and so forth, and every one of them should be. As you can see there, the doctors and nurses who attempted to put the wounded back together, day in and day out, they were there all night long trying to help the soldiers and get them to go. More people from in the Vietnam War, within an hour, in most cases, you could be in the field back at a hospital where you had a doctor, somebody looking out for you because of the helicopter. The dust off crews. Now, how would you like to be in a helicopter? You're a helicopter pilot, and you got wounded Americans down there. You got to bring that helicopter in, which is like a bullet magnet, because everybody sees that little red cross on the side. That's not to say, don't shoot me. That's the target. You're sitting there in a helicopter. Now, a helicopter takes both hands and both feet to keep it going properly. You're sitting there, and all of a sudden, these bullets are breaking the plexiglass all around you. And you have to sit there and be still while the medics are loading these wounded on the helicopters and so forth. These guys are so busy getting the wounded on, they don't have time to worry about themselves. It takes a lot of guts to go in and help these wounded soldiers. I mean, it has to be pretty bad before these guys would not go in and help to get the Americans out, the wounded. And it wasn't necessarily all Americans. They would bring out the communists, and they would bring out the Montagnards or the South Vietnamese soldiers. Everybody was important to these people, and they gave everything they had to go in and get them. And it just, the guts and the dedication these people had, the nurses and so forth. One of the men who from North Carolina, his name was Lawrence Joel. If you've ever been to Greensboro, the Joel Coliseum, he was a medic. And he was received the Medal of Honor from one of the early battles in 1965. It was by the 173rd Airborne, called the Battle of Hump, November 5th, 1965. You may have heard Big and Rich, the country western stars, sing the 8th of November song, with Chris Christopherson did the beginning of it. So these guys are all true heroes, and anyhow you look at it. Okay, another 0 as far as I'm concerned, and you've probably saw the last couple of shows I did. I did 2 shows on how Ken Burns missed it. The Vietnam veterans have been trying to set the record straight. See, the concern that most of us have is people going to use this as the definitive story of the Vietnam War. And there's a lot of mistruths in this documentary. I use the word loosely. And this is an article by James Faulkner, and with some PBS documentary and so forth. And go into I'm going to skip down a little bit here. Laura Sawyer, a Vietnam War veteran, historian, director of Vietnam Veterans for Factory History. If you have a question yourself or you're talking to somebody and they make a statement, this website, VVFH, Vietnam Veterans for Factory History, go to this website and read what these people had to say about Ken Burns' story and get the real story of what happened to anything that went on in Vietnam, pretty much. In an interview with far left publication Mother Jones, neither Burns or co-producer Lynn Novick or his interviewer mentioned the word communism or communist during the whole thing. If you saw the story, if you saw the thing, most of what they used were bitter Vietnam veterans, even though about 90% of everybody that had been interviewed that went to Vietnam said they'd do it again, maybe with different under different aspects. But most of the people in the thing said that was bitter about it. Mostly the North Vietnamese were better than the South Vietnamese. They even quoted a general in there, an American general, said we were fighting for the wrong side. So if you get a chance to see the documentary, before you do that, go to Vietnam Veterans for Factory History and get some of the real background before you watch it. So, but cinematically, it's some great photos and it's a great story. It's just not a true story. Okay. PJ Media further reports that the documentary obscured the evil intrinsics to communism, and that should be an outrage to every American interested in an honest appraisal of history. Even if you are not a Vietnam vet, if you're out there, you should be upset about this documentary and the way it was depicted. Write PBS and let them know how you think about it. Basically, let's get the word out there how bad this documentary sucked. Okay. A letter from the Vietnam Veterans for Factory History noted they had 4 basic issues of the series. They felt that documentary showed U.S. support for South Vietnamese as blustering, blundering, and jingoism. In other words, there wasn't much to it. They were outraged over the minimization of Ho Chi Minh's communism. It almost made Ho Chi Minh sound like this benevolent, wonderful grandfather. The fact that he started so many different communist movements in China and Russia and so forth, and went to Russia for training and so forth. They felt the documentary glossed over communist atrocities. For some reason, we only talk about the things that the Americans did. We never talk about the worst things or equal things that the communists did. So that's some of the things that, one of the many things. Now let's talk about this hero here, Sgt Bob Howard. He served 5 tours in Vietnam. And it was during that time he was nominated for the Medal of Honor, which is the highest award we give, on 3 separate occasions. He was a Green Beret on the highly classified Military Assistance Command Studies and Observation, MACV-SOC. You would not believe the people who claim to be MACV-SOCs, and there weren't that many. And his men engaged in black ops all over North Vietnam. In other words, they went in and did things that we didn't suppose to know about. And then into Cambodia at a time when his actions were very sensitive to world opinion of the United States. Boy, look at those ribbons. So even though he was put in for the Medal of Honors, they couldn't get him because he didn't really exist. His job didn't really exist. This is why his first 2 actions were downgraded to the Distinguished Service Cross, which is not nothing wrong with those either. The government did not want to draw the attention to the MACV-SOGs, and because they were special operatives and did a lot of clandestine and so forth. His Medal of Honor finally came because of a rescue mission he led into Cambodia to find POC Roger Sheridan. Howard was a sergeant first class at the time, and after his platoon left the cover of its helicopter, it was attacked by 2 companies of NVA, about 300 men. Howard took shrapnel to the front of his legs and forearms from a grenade, and his rifle was blown to pieces out of his hands. When he sat up and he saw his platoon leader seriously wounded and exposed to fire, and proceeded to crawl through withering machine gun and small arms fire, as he administered first aid, a bullet blew one of his ammunition pouches off his belt, detonating several magazines of M16 rounds. As you can see, he was not hiding someplace. He was out there in the kill zone. He still crawled back with the wounded platoon leader, then crawled among his buddies, administering first aid and directing their fires to better places. This lasted for 3.5 hours until they finally fought the NVA off and permitted the arrival of 2 more helicopters. Howard refused to leave until everybody was aboard, and all the while taking heavily enemy fire from within the jungle. Howard was wounded 14 times in 54 months performing the deeds like this. I know people that came home after 3 Purple Hearts, of which they hurt themselves. Howard received his Medal of Honor from President Richard Nixon in March of 1971, and he retired with the rank of colonel in 1992 from Sergeant First Class to Tunnel. This man, no matter how you look at it and study it, is a true hero for the things he did. Another 0. I hope most of you out there have seen the missing man table. We do a ceremony here for over 30 years now, calling out the names of those of North Carolina, and we all do the missing man table. It's a very moving ceremony and so forth. But the VA had decided there was something about it that they didn't want happen, that was wrong and could not be done. If you look at the picture before and you look at the picture on after, and see if you can figure out what the differences are. Maybe if you see that red arrow off to your left, that'll kind of give you an idea of the before and after. Okay? One of the most important values that our heroes have fought for is the freedom of religion, as it has played an important role in the foundation and prosperity of our country. However, the VA made a move that undercut the importance of religious liberty for veterans by removing Bibles from memorials and clinics dedicated to Vietnam veterans who were taken prisoner or missing in action. In other words, the VA centers and the VA hospitals and all this sort of stuff, they had to take the Bibles out of the missing man table. The Establishment Clause does not require that you remove Bibles from the missing man table displays. Oklahoma Senator James Lankford and Virginia Representative Randy Forbes wrote in a letter to VA Secretary Robert McDonnell while he was there. The mere presence of a Bible coerces no one. Nowhere in the Constitution did it says that you can't have a religion or you couldn't have a Bible. It just says that the government cannot sponsor a religion. But that's been all kind of checked out and so forth. Turn around. In regard to the federal guidelines, no Bibles or religious articles are to be placed on the MIA POW tables. United States Army Colonel Gregory Peterson, commander of Tomiana Army Depot in Pennsylvania, has commanded. In fact, the Supreme Court addressed that issue in 2014 when it determined that prayer at town board meetings was constitutional and an Establishment Clause violation is not made at any time a person experiences a sense of affront from the expression of contrary views, the decision exclaims. So there's no legal reason whatsoever that the Bible cannot be on the missing man table at all. Now let's talk about this man when you're talking about a hero. A Hispanic, Master Sergeant Roy B. Benavides. On May 2nd, 1968, 12 Green Berets were surrounded near Loc Ninh, South Vietnam, by an entire battalion of NVA. In other words, there were 12 Americans and their group that was with them versus about 1,000 communists. They dug in and tried to hold them off, but were not going to last long. Benavides heard the distress call over the radio in town and boarded a rescue helicopter with first aid equipment. He didn't have time to grab a weapon before jumping on the helicopter, so he voluntarily jumped into a hot LZ armed with only his knife. Just think about it a little bit as we go. Nothing but a knife. You're always told don't take a knife to a gunfight, but he couldn't have time to get his rifle. He sprinted across 75 meters of open terrain through withering small arms machine gun fire to reach the pinned down MACV SOG team. By the time he reached them, he had been shot 4 times, twice in the right leg, once through both cheeks, which knocked out 4 molars and a glancing shot off his head. He ignored these wounds and began administering first aid. The rescue chopper left as it was not designed to extract men. An extraction chopper was sent for, and Benavides took command of the men by directing their fire around the edges of the clearing in order to facilitate the chopper's landing. So not only was he there to rendering first aid, he was also took over control and was telling men to their fields of fire. When the aircraft arrived, he supervised the loading of the wounded on board. While throwing smoke canisters to direct the chopper's exact landing, he was wounded severely and at all times under heavy enemy crossfire, but still carried and dragged half the wounded men to the chopper. Okay? He then ran alongside the landing skids, providing protective fire into the trees as the chopper moved across the LZ, collecting the wounded. The enemy fire got worse, and Benavides was hit solidly in the left shoulder. He got back up and ran to the platoon leader, dead in the open, retrieved classified documents. He was shot in the abdomen, and a grenade detonated nearby, peppering his back with shrapnel. The chopper pilot was mortally wounded then, and his chopper crashed. Benavides was in extremely critical condition and still refused to fall. He ran to the wreckage and got the wounded out of the aircraft and ranged them into a defensive perimeter, wait for the next chopper. The enemy automatic rifle fire and grenades only intensified, and Benavides ran and crawled around the perimeter, giving out water and ammunition. The man was not going to give up. The NVA were building up to wipe them out, and Benavides called in a tactical airstrike with squawk box and threw smoke to direct the fire of American gunships. In other words, he had the Prick 22 radio, and to make sure that they didn't drop the bombs on them, he threw out smoke grenades so they could show they were. Just before the extraction chopper landed, he was shot again in the left thigh while giving first aid to the wounded man. He still managed to get to his feet and carry some of the wounded men to the chopper, directing the others when the NVA soldiers rushed from the woods and clubbed him over the head with an AK-47. That's how close they were to the enemy. One of the enemy guys beat him over the head with his AK-47. This caused a skull fracture and a deep gash to his left upper arm, and yet he still got back up and decapitated the soldier with one swing of his knife. Remember the knife he brought to a gunfight, severing the spine and all tissue at one side of the neck. He then resumed carrying the wounded to the chopper and returning for others. He was shot twice more in the lower back. The man was just not going to give up. There he is. And if you get a chance on Facebook, there's a recording he has done speaking to a group. If you ever get a chance to hear it, I think you probably can go online and pick it up on YouTube or something. He shot 2 more NVA soldiers trying to board the chopper, then made one last trip around the LZ landing zone to be sure all documents were retrieved, and finally boarded the chopper. He had lost 2 quarts of blood. I don't know how he was even able to walk losing that much. Before he blacked out, he shouted to one of the other Green Berets, "Another great day to be in South Vietnam." This battle lasted 6 hours, and he was wounded 37 times. 37 times, and the man never quit rendering aid to the wounded and giving support to those who were still fighting. Now, you want to look at a hero, that's a hero. He was hero to so many men. How many people live because of this man? You couldn't write this story in fiction. Okay? On February 24th, 1981, President Ronald Reagan presented Roy P. Benavides with the Medal of Honor. Reagan turned to the press and said, if the story of his heroism were a movie script, you would not believe it, which is basically what I just said. But the man is personifies a hero, and so as the other man we talked about. Okay. Another 0. During the election period of time, Richard Nixon had an aide to contact the North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese to tell them that if they would hold off on signing any kind of peace agreement until he became president, that they'd get a better deal. How many Americans died during this period of time while he was saying hold off? Now, this was discovered with the Nixon papers, but also President Johnson knew about it. In a telephone conversation with H.R. Haldeman, who would go on to become White House Chief of Staff, Nixon gave the instructions that a friendly intermediary, well, I'm having a time with these words, should keep working on South Vietnamese leaders to persuade them not to agree to deal before the election. The Nixon campaign clandestine effort to thwart President Lyndon Johnson's peace initiative that fall has long been a source of controversy and scholarship. Ample evidence has been emerged documenting the involvement of Nixon's campaign. But Mr. Haldeman's notes appear to confirm long-standing suspicion that Nixon himself was directly involved, despite his later denials. Learning of his what was going on, President Johnson was livid. He ordered more bugs and privately groused that Nixon behavior amounted to treason. Now, I don't know whether the bugs were legal or not, but they had them. But lacking hard evidence that Nixon was directly involved, Johnson opted not to go public. Oh, yes, the government is so good out there letting us know. Now, another hero. I hate to start this one because this man deserves everything he can get. I'm going to give you a little bit of background. I think I'm going to save this one until our next show. This is Rocky Versace. He was captured by two men that I've already done a show on, two men that I knew. Colonel Nick Rowe, who was escaped after 5 years and so forth, being captured and out in the jungles of Vietnam. He was not in Hanoi Hilton, not taking anything away from those guys, but these guys were out in the jungles and so forth with the leeches and the mosquitoes and so forth. Rocky was the leader. Rocky had gone to school to be a minister, and then he ended up going to West Point, and he was the leader of this group that was out when they were ambushed. And Rocky and Dan Pitzer, who was a medic, and Nick Rowe, who was they were all special forces, but Rocky's story of what he did and what he did for the other POWs is too important. So I'm going to save him. As you can see there, he received the Medal of Honor, but one of the reasons he received the Medal of Honor because of people like Nick Rowe, who was invited to the White House to talk with, I believe it was Nixon, or Ford, to talk. He himself said, Rocky Versace needs the Medal of Honor. And it took until recently for this man to be recognized and received the Medal of Honor. Nick and Dan both are gone before I think Rocky got this, but this is his story. So our next show will be finishing up of this story of Rocky Versace, of our heroes. I think he's important enough. I'll be a hero that you would want to hear about him. And thank you for watching the show. And I hope that was some value to you. You got something out of it. To me, I just listen to the stories, even when I'm reading it off here, of these heroes. It's just unbelievable what they did and so forth. So our next show, which is March 14th, 8 o'clock, same time, same station, right here will be Vietnam Facts and Comparisons with the finishing up of Rocky and his story. I know, if nothing else, that you really would get a lot out of listening the next time to hear Rocky's story alone, the things he did, and to receive the Medal of Honor. He did not come home from being a POW. I will drop that off and let you know. But again, thank you for joining the show. Let us know. Reach out, DixonBill80@yahoo.com, and let me know if there's anything you would like me to cover. You have a comment and so forth. Didn't want to do it during the show. You have a good evening. I'm looking forward to meeting you all again on March 14th, which is a Wednesday night, 8 o'clock. Thank you. Have a good day tomorrow.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section at nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Telestream's Wirecast software, StreamingGear.com, Carolina Apparel, and deltaforce.net.